Okay, what is up there YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have another video on the Boer War, or weapons of the Boer War, or Boer weapons of the Anglo-Boer Wars of the 1880s through 1903. Now this video is going to be on the second Anglo-Boer War, and in this video I'm going to go over the basic infantry weapons and some rare weapons, infantry weapons, used by the Boer forces and Boer commandos of the South African Republic and the Orange Free State that were used against invading British forces from British colonial Africa during the Second Boer War. But first, let's go over some background. Now, the Second Anglo-Boer War began on the 11th of October 1899 and lasted until May 1902. And it actually began technically at the end of the First Anglo-Boer War. Now, during the First Anglo-Boer War, during the lead up to the First Anglo-Boer War, the British attempted to annex the state of Transvaal, or the Transvaal Republic, and this led to an eventual uprising against the British plans to fully annex the region, leading to the First Anglo-Boer War. Eventually, the Boers managed to beat the British in 1881. A few years later, in 1886, gold was discovered in the Pretoria region, which is located in South Africa, or the South African Republic. This discovery of gold led to a gold rush within the Boer Republic. This gold rush, or this influx of gold wealth, actually increased the economy tenfold of both the South African Republic and the Orange Free State. As a result of this, the South African Republic was able to update their infrastructure by building new bridges, railroads, and investing in more companies and manufacturing industries for the South African Republic and the Orange Free State. Now, both of these republics were right next door to the British-controlled parts of South Africa, of the southern half of Africa. Now, Britain pretty much controlled almost all of the South African region. This is the southern tip of the continent of Africa I'm talking about. So the British were kind of jealous. They were looking at the Boers like, man, they got all this gold. And they also had diamonds too. In the 1870s, the Boers discovered diamonds in their region. And that was one of the reasons for the First Boer War in 1880. So the British began drawing up plans to eventually invade the South African Republic again and the newly formed state of the Orange Free State. The South African Republic was led by President Paul Kruger. Now, the Orange Free State was led by President Martinus Steyn. Now, due to the influx of wealth in both the South African Republic and the Orange Free State, this led to a large number of British workers coming from British control of South Africa, which was pretty much the rest of the southern half of the African continent, and British Rhodesia, which was in the north. So you had British workers, both white and black British workers, coming to South Africa, the Republic, and the Orange Free State to work and get involved in the gold rush. As a result of this, the British drew up plans to eventually annex both South African Republic and the Orange Free State. But first they needed an excuse. Now, the British wanted to frame the South Africans as being super racist and having some form of slavery for both the black and white British workers that were coming from the British colonies to work in the South African republics. And then this led to the British drawing up plans to launch a raid against Paul Kruger, who was the president of the South African Republic. Now, this raid, known as the Jameson Raid of 1885, was meant to make the British seem like the good guys, stopping this evil, racist Paul Kruger fella from having both these African and white British laborers as his indentured servants. But this didn't really make any sense, as they were all being paid. So can't really be a slave or an indentured servant if you're being paid for it. During this raid, the British had about 500 policemen and soldiers from Rhodesia attempt to ambush both Paul Kruger and many of his political members and many other political figures from the South African Republic, along with some of the military personnel from the South African Republic. The raid ultimately failed, and this led to tensions breaking out between both the South African republics and the British colonial forces in the region, which eventually led to war breaking out 4 years later in October of 1899, leading to the Second Boer War, or the outbreak of the Second Boer War. So let's go over some of the Boer rifles. Let's go over the South African Boer rifles used by both the South African Republic and the Orange Free State. Now, in the years before the Second Anglo-Boer War, the president of South Africa, Paul Kruger, wanted to modernize the Boer Army, or the Transvaal Army as it was known as. So he began importing weapons from Germany. Now the first rifle he purchased was the German Mauser model 1895, also known today as the Chilean Mauser, as it was the most common rifle used by the Chilean armed forces in the late 19th and early 20th century. Now these were chambered for the 7x57mm Mauser and had a 5-round internal magazine. And the Dutch-speaking Boers had purchased some 37,000 of these rifles in the years before 1899, along with at least 40 to 50 million rounds of ammunition. So these were the most advanced rifles in terms of their age that the Boers were using. The Boers also had at least 5 or 10,000 Martini Henry rifles that were captured during the end of the last Boer War. Now these were single-shot breech-loading rifles chambered for the .577 Martini Henry black powder cartridge, and these were captured from the British forces during their defeat in the First Anglo-Boer War in 1880 through 1881. And they also had about a few 100,000 rounds of ammunition that were left behind by the British, or that were purchased off the black market from British colonial territories after the First Anglo-Boer War. And many of the Boer soldiers and commandos used Martini Henrys also. A somewhat rare rifle, but not really rare, as at least 7,000 of these were made, were Austrian-made single-shot cartridge rifles. Now, the rifle that the Boers imported the most from Austria was the Model 1885 Goodies, or the Goodies Model 1885 single-shot cartridge rifle. Now, this was a single-shot metallic cartridge rifle, a very high-powered rifle for the time that was imported from Austria-Hungary. And it was chambered for the 8x60mm black powder cartridge, or semi-powder cartridge, which was very similar to the French Lebel cartridge, technically. And the Boers managed to import some 7,000 of these Goodies Model 1885 rifles for use during the Second Anglo-Boer War. Now, if I had to choose, this is one of my favorite of the single-shot rifles used by the Boer. Now, these Goodies rifles were manufactured by the Austrian Steyr company, famous for their Mannlicher series of bolt-action cartridge rifles that were famous for use in the First World War. Another rifle imported by the Boers also came from Germany, and this was the German Mauser Model 1896 carbine. These were bolt-action carbines for the same cartridge as the Model 1895, and these were purchased along with the Mauser Model 1895 rifles. They were also purchased by the Dutch-speaking Boers, or the Afrikaans-speaking Boers. The Boers purchased at least 2,000 to 5,000 of these Model 1896 carbines, and they were some pretty advanced rifles for the time. Also, the Boers had captured a large number of British-made rifles, like the Lee Metford series of bolt-action rifles and the Lee Enfield series of bolt-action rifles. Now, these rifles came into service in 1888 and 1895, and they had become the replacement for the older Martini Henry and Schneider Enfield series of rifles used by the British in the First Anglo-Boer War of 1880 through 1881. They were chambered for the .303 Enfield cartridge and had a 10-round internal magazine. And these rifles were famous for use later on in the First and Second World War. Now, there was also a second and third version known as the Lee Speed. These were faster variants, or faster firing variants, of both the Lee Metford and Lee Enfield rifle. And the Boers managed to capture a few thousand of these rifles during the war and used them against their former British owners. So these were pretty much the rifles that were used by the Boers. The Boers also had some older rifles, as I mentioned in my previous video. One of the most popular rifles was a British hunting rifle known as the Wesley Richards Model 1869, and this was a single-shot breech-loading rifle chambered for the .450 metallic cartridge, or metallic/paper cartridge. And these were famous hunting rifles used by the Boers in the First Boer War, and they were still being used in the Second Boer War. You also had imported weapons like the Swiss Vetterli Model 1869. These were tube-fed bolt-action repeating rifles, chambered for the 10.4 by 38mm Swiss rimfire cartridge. And the Boers had begun importing these in the build-up to the First Boer War, and were still importing these during the build-up to the Second Boer War. And these rifles had an 11-round tubular magazine and had the highest magazine capacity of all the rifles used by the Boers. The Boers also imported a number of American Winchester rifles, the Model 1866, the Model 1873, and most importantly, the Model 1876. The 1876 being the most common of the American imported Winchester rifles. These Winchester rifles had tubular magazines that could hold anywhere from 8 to 15 rounds, and they were chambered for a variety of cartridges, the .4440 being the most common. And these were also used by the Boers in the First Boer War, and they were still being used in the Second Boer War. Now, the German Mausers were the most common rifle, as the Boers had about 40,000 of these at the very start of the war. Now, as the war dragged on, they began to run out of ammunition for the Mauser rifles and had to rely largely on captured British Lee Metford, Lee Enfield, and Martini Enfield rifles. They were still being used by British forces and British colonial troops from other parts of Africa. Now, the Boers also imported a number of German and French light artillery, one of these being considered an early machine gun, known as the Maxim Nordenfeld guns. These were fully automatic autocannons that were manufactured in the 1880s. In fact, these were manufactured in both Britain and Germany. They were chambered for the 37 by 94mm cartridge or round, which is actually a large caliber 37mm explosive shell. These machine gun/autocannons had a rate of fire of 300 rounds per minute, and they were usually fed by either a 10 to 30 round fabric belt containing the 37mm round. Now, this was the most effective piece of Boer artillery. It was basically like a 19th century grenade launcher in a way, automatic grenade launcher in a way. It was also very good at scaring both the British and British colonial forces. Most of the British forces had never had to deal with any kind of machine gun, whether it be a machine gun chambered for your basic rifle cartridge or an autocannon, especially not a German/British made autocannon like this Maxim Nordenfeld. Now, the gun is actually a British gun. The Maxim Nordenfeld is a British designed gun that was used by the British colonial forces in the 19th century, late 19th century. But they were also licensed and copied and manufactured in Germany and a few other countries. And this is how the Boers got their hands on some of these machine guns/autocannons. Now, these were the advanced infantry weapons, rifles, and machine guns used by Boer forces during the Second Anglo-Boer War. Now, keep in mind, unlike the First Anglo-Boer War, in which the Boers managed to defeat the British in the Second Boer War eventually defeated the Boers. In fact, the Second Boer War is pretty much like the British Vietnam of the late 19th and early 20th century. This is also one of the most famous guerrilla conflicts or guerrilla war conflicts of the late 19th and early 20th century. During the war, the Boers relied largely on guerrilla warfare, especially towards the middle and end of the conflict, as they had lost a lot of territory during the first days of the conflict. The British had actually learned their lesson somewhat at first, from the First Boer War. During this Boer War, during the Second Boer War, the British managed to overrun the Boer defenders using a large number of manpower, or a large amount of manpower. They had about 350,000 troops, both British regular army troops and colonial troops, versus only about 60,000 Boer commandos and just anyone who had a gun living in the South African Republic and the Orange Free State. In terms of casualties, the British would suffer some 22,000 plus dead and 75,000 plus wounded overall, totaling about 99,000 casualties total. The Boer forces would suffer just 6,000 dead and just 24,000 captured. The number of wounded is largely unknown, but it was at least 5,000 or 6,000. So the Boers suffered very, very few casualties during this conflict, and that's because they mostly relied on guerrilla warfare for 2/3 of the conflict. They were basically using hit-and-run tactics, using mostly modern European-made weapons manufactured in Germany, and even rifles that were manufactured in the US and elsewhere, along with captured British rifles like the Lee Metford and Lee Enfield rifles. The situation got so bad that the British were infuriated with the Boers and set up the first generation of concentration camps. Yes, the concentration camps you saw in World War II are actually based on the concentration camps that the British had built during the Second Anglo-Boer War. So these weapons, in a way, kind of pissed off the British to the point where they basically destroyed South Africa somewhat, at least on a societal level, by killing so many civilians. Over 46,000 civilians died in these British concentration camps during the Second Anglo-Boer War of 1899 through 1902. The Second Anglo-Boer War had a very high casualty rate, and it was largely due to the fact that the British simply got so pissed off that the Boers had such good weaponry for such a small force. Remember, the Boers only had about 40 to 50,000 troops in total, plus a few thousand of the African auxiliaries from various tribes in the region. And so there you have it. These were the weapons or infantry rifles and machine guns used during the Second Anglo-Boer War of 1899 through 1902. Now, I can continue this series, and in the next series, I think I should go over some artillery used in the First and Second Anglo-Boer War, or I should do armored vehicles, armored fighting vehicles. Now, the British actually used a ton of experimental armored fighting vehicles, or had developed a ton of different armored fighting vehicles for use in the Second Anglo-Boer War of 1899 through 1902-1903. So I think I should do those videos next when it comes to covering weapons of the Anglo-Boer Wars of the late 19th and early 20th century. But which of these rifles did you like the most? Me, I actually like the Steyr Gudde in terms of its look and design. Now, the German Mauser and the Lee Enfield and Lee Metfords are more advanced because they're repeating cartridge rifles, but the Steyr Gudde's rifle from 1885 is something I didn't know about before doing research on these weapons. Now, I should have done research on sidearms too, but I think I'll save that for another video also. So what do you all think of this? So which of these rifles did you like the most that were used by the Boer and the British forces? Please tell me in the comments section below, and until next time, this was J-Man Time signing off.